One of the reasons for the rejection of the authenticity and inspiration of the New Testament is that because so much material in the New Testament centers on the historical claim of miracle. Now we know, for example, that miracles are recorded in the Old Testament, but there is not a consistent, constant pattern of the working of miracles throughout the whole history of the Old Testament, but rather the appearance of miracles in the historical text tend to be clustered in certain crucial times, and most significantly at times when a major revelation of God is being brought before the world. One of the heaviest centers of the cluster of miracle that we find in the Old Testament scriptures is in and around the life of Moses. And we remember in the Old Testament that the reason why Moses was invested or endowed with the power to perform miracles is because of the extreme difficulty of the task that had been given to him by God. You remember that when God commissioned Moses and told him to go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go," and to go and tell the people of Israel to follow him in this Exodus experience, Moses said, how are they going to know that you are speaking to me and that the word that I will be proclaiming will be your word? And remember, God said, "Moses, put your hand in your cloak," and he did. And then when he pulled it out, it was leprous. He said, "Put it in there again." And when he pulled it out the second time, it was clean. He said, "Take your staff and throw it on the ground." And he did, and it turned into a snake. He said, "Now reach down and pick it up," and it turned back into a stick. And we know of the contest that Moses had with the magicians of Pharaoh's court. Well, we see the same marvelous display of the supernatural with the advent of the new age of prophecy, with the appearance of Elijah and Elisha in the Old Testament. But you don't read about miracles performed by David or by Solomon or by Jeremiah or by some of the greatest people who appear in the Old Testament. Not even with Abraham do we read of Abraham's performing miracles. So there has to be some reason that God had in history to cluster these miracles the way that he did. But there is no place where we see such a heavy concentration of miracle than when Jesus appears on the earth. One literary critic of the New Testament said, one thing is unmistakable, and that is that the record of Jesus is a record that is ablaze with miracles. Now the question is, do we trust them? Are they true? 19th century naturalism denied them wholesale. 20th century neoliberalism, as I saw mentioned with Bultmann, categorically deny the historical reality of these miracles. In fact, one of the elements of so-called higher criticism or form criticism is by looking at various passages in the New Testament and seeing the literary form in which they occur. And one of the things that the form critics have done is they have examined the miracle stories to see if there is a pattern that is repeatable. And they have noticed such a pattern of these so-called miracle stories where a severe problem like a disease or a malady or affliction is first described. It's kind of the before and after of the before and after story. And then the actual work is performed, that is the miracle, the result of which is some kind of deliverance or rescue. And then the characteristic response in this pattern is one of amazement or astonishment. When you learn Greek in seminary, one of the first words that you have to learn in the Greek language is the word thaumatsai, which means to be astonished. And the reason why it's one of the first words you learn is because the high degree of frequency of the occurrence of this word in the New Testament. Every time Jesus walked around, it seems that the response to people, to his behavior, was one of astonishment. Now, I think that's important for us to realize when we consider the New Testament record of the miracles of Christ. Because we have a tendency to judge the first century church and the writers of the Scripture from a rather Olympian posture of cultural arrogance from our day. We say, oh, these people are pre-scientific, they're primitive, they're credulous and gullible. I mean, they lived in a world where they took miracles for granted. Do a word study, a frequency study of the word astonishment. Get in touch with the response of Jesus' contemporaries to his power and to his display of power. People had never seen anything like it. And I don't care what period of history people lived in, seeing somebody raised from the dead who was dead and entombed for 4 days was not commonplace. And people in the first century were not so gullible as to swallow hook, line, and sinker every report of somebody's being raised from the dead after being in a state of physiological decay. People in the first century were not stupid. They were not dummies. Neither can it be justly said of them that they were unscientific or even pre-scientific. Now, they didn't know what is known in our day scientifically, just as we don't know what presumably will be known in the next century scientifically, and they may look at us with the same kind of arrogance and say how naive we are with some of the views we cling to. But the fundamental issue here, with respect to the New Testament record surrounding the works of Christ, is the question of whether we believe there is a God who has the power to create a universe ex nihilo. Once that's established, then the only question is it this God who is manifesting his endorsement of this person who is displaying these powers that are recorded? You know, it's interesting that the first century critics of Jesus never denied that he was doing miracles. They were so obvious. But the Pharisees denied the source of his power, said that he was doing these things through the power of Satan. But at least they recognized that the power that Jesus manifested while he walked on this earth was superhuman, was extraordinary, and was attended by miracles. Now, before we look at an example or two of miracles, I want to ask the question, what were the functions of miracles in the New Testament? Why miracles? And why don't